Welcome, whoever you are, to Meg's Magical Mansion,
a virtual guest house for spiritual wayfarers.
a place where the ordinary becomes magical,
where wisdom is yours for the asking,
and where your higher nature is just a wish away. Thanks for joining us here at the Magical Mansion. I'm Meg, here with the fluffy Miss Alice Poopers, and of course the fantabulous Miss Parfait.
Charmed. And today we're taking a look at one of the most mysterious groups of pagans ever.
You know, this is an ancient group of pagans who were not only spiritual leaders, but they were also served as judges and were advisors to kings.
Some say they were the most powerful people of their times.
So who are we talking about?
The Druids! The Druids were a very mysterious group. They kept no written records, depending instead on memorization, relying on memorization.
And Druids possessed a vast knowledge base that came from years and years of learning and training and was passed down by word of mouth.
Wow, talk about your oral traditions. You know, the Druids were religious leaders, but they were also astronomers, healers, and herbalists.
They were able to divine the future through a variety of techniques, which of course made them indispensable to kings.
But because they kept no written records, what we know about them has come from the writings of outsiders who have experiences with the Druids.
People like Julius Caesar, who was an enemy, and, I don't think he had a lot of nice stuff to say about them.
Yeah, it's probably not the most reliable source, but today we're going to try and take a look at what we do know about the Druids and take a look at some of the misinformation that we also have to find out who were the Druids.
So who were the Druids? The ancient Druids were the holders of knowledge for the Celtic people. Their name may have come from a Celtic word meaning knower of the oak tree. They were priests, scholars, astronomers, and judges. But we know very little about these first Druids. They were holders and keepers of knowledge, but all that knowledge was passed down by word of mouth. The Druids kept their power by not putting any of their vast knowledge down in writing. Instead, Druids studied for years, memorizing large amounts of information. And what little information we do have from this time comes from the writings of people like Julius Caesar. He spent quite a bit of time in Gaul fighting the Celts from 58 to 51 BCE. So his viewpoint wasn't necessarily friendly, as, these are the people he was busy conquering. And Gaul, where was Gaul? So Gaul was located in Western Europe in what would now cover France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Italy, Northern Italy, Germany, and parts of Switzerland. But according to Caesar's writings, the Druids were held in high esteem in Celtic societies. They were equal to noblemen. As priests, they were in charge of all sacrificial activities, both public and private. As scholars and teachers, many high-born young men went to them for their education. As judges, they settled all kinds of arguments. Caesar wrote that they met each year in a sacred place and judged all legal disputes. And the Druids would also elect an arch-druid to be the leader of all the Druids. Caesar also wrote that these early Druids believed in rebirth and reincarnation, that the soul lived on from one life to the next. They also apparently did not participate in wars or battles, and they didn't pay tribute to any king. Many young men who aspired to be Druids studied philosophy, astronomy, stories of the gods, poetry, spending their lives training their minds. Caesar also wrote that the Druids performed many sacrifices, including human sacrifices, famously using a giant wicker man, a large wicker cage that could hold animals as well as people. And while the Druids preferred to sacrifice criminals and the gravely ill, they would sacrifice innocent people if necessary, according to Caesar. Caesar quotes earlier accounts in his writings from Posidonius, a famous Stoic philosopher, who also gave accounts of the Druids. And he said the Druids often met in open clearings in the forest, and the Druids were also said to have a variety of methods for divining the future. They used bird flight and the behavior of the wildlife around them. They observed and understood weather patterns. They used the position of the celestial bodies, and they used small stones, Boulden stones, little stones with natural hollows in them. And they used ogham sticks, which were much like ruins. And some say they may have even used spoons to divine. But the Druids used their skills of deep empathy and their ability to connect with the divine to help people find their way in life. Druids in Gaul and later in Britain were suppressed by the Romans. And as Christianity moved into the area, the Druids lost their priestly functions. But they still served as poets, judges, astronomers, and judges. But by the 7th century, the Druids were mostly extinct and forgotten. And all of that cool stuff I just told you, all of it may or may not even be true. We just don't know for sure. But as these stories and traditions have continued to be passed down from generation to generation, the memory of the Druid remains alive. And I actually think some of the most interesting part of Druid history is the more modern history, because people took the tales of old, the stories of the past, and reimagined Druids in newer and increasingly more modern ways. And this interest in Druids has been going on longer than you might think. You know, in the medieval times, bards and seers took over some of the roles that had been performed by Druids. And moving into the Renaissance, we see people taking a renewed interest in the Greek and Roman classics. And through those, they rediscovered the Druids. And this led to a Druid revival, and scholars of the 17th century started to link the Druids to the mysterious stone monoliths and circles, such as Stonehenge, located throughout the region, which we now know actually predate the Druids. But the notion that Druids were brutes who sacrificed and burned people began to soften and change, and an appreciation for their knowledge and wisdom began to develop. And we see this appreciation as organizations such as the Freemasons and the Ancient Archaeological Order of Druids, which formed in 1781, these organizations start to come into being. And the Victorians gave us the Neo-Druids. These were organizations that were not necessarily religious, but they took inspiration from the Ancient Druids. These groups were more like social clubs, focusing on community and mutual aid. One such group, the Sheffield Equalized Independent Druids, later evolved into an insurance company. They were most popular with the working class in large cities and in coal mining towns. So these Victorian-era Druids were more focused on the aspects of community and social connection than on the actual religious practices or beliefs of the Druids. But the 20th century saw continued interest in Druidism. People like Union activist and Druid George Watson McGregor Reed, who formed the Ancient Druid Order and later went on to form the Church of the Universal Bond. And of course, Gerald Gardner, who many of you know as the father of modern-day Wicca, but who started out in the Ancient Druid Order. And with his friend Ross Nichols, another member of the Ancient Order of Druids, worked on that overlapping area between Druidic and Wiccan practices. And Ross Nichols later went on to found the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids with Vera Chapman, which is still active today. The Reformed Druids of North America started out in 1963 at Carleton College in Minnesota as a joke, a way to get out of the college's school policy that required students to go to church. Some church, any church. But the participants formed this church so they'd have a place to go and attend, and they ended up finding great value in the group, which adheres to a lack of dogma and has only 2 tenets. And here they are. One of the many ways in which the object of man's search for religious truth can be found is through nature. Nature being one of the primary concerns in man's life and struggle, and being one of the objects of creation, is important to man's spiritual quest. In addition to that original group, or as they call them, groves, that is the mother grove, there are now over 40 groves or proto-groves around the United States and Canada. And many of today's Druids focus on their spiritual and physical connection to nature and the history and rituals of the ancient Druids, with the freedom to adapt them for modern times. Of course, modern day pagans no longer sacrifice living beings. Rather, they have become active stewards for the planet. Environmental awareness and activism being important for many Druids in the 21st century. And the Order of Bards and Ovates and Druids is still active and is now led by Philip Carr-Gomm, who, by the way, has a channel right here on YouTube where he hosts Tea with a Druid, and I will link his channel in the description. Well, I'll say one thing for those oral traditions. The Romans can conquer you, and time can try to snuff you out. But the word of mouth will always carry the traditions and the stories forward to the next generation. So, while it really does kind of suck that we know so little about the ancient Druids, perhaps the legends that have been passed down are the exact inspiration we need to be Druids here and now for the 21st century. And it's up to us to continue to tell those stories and trust our oral traditions to carry us through to future generations.
Well, that's our look at the Druids, and there's still so many unanswered questions.
For sure, absolutely. But it's really nice to see modern day Druids reviving the old ways and finding new ways to keep these old practices alive.
Yeah, and the vast knowledge the Druids possessed seems to be lost to time, unfortunately. And we may never know what they actually did know.
I know.
It's really sad. But to think about the Druids and to think about the whole Wicker Man thing, I gotta be honest with you, I remember the original Christopher Lee movie, the old movie.
How much I love it.
Oh yeah, and I love that movie, but do you think that really happened? I mean...
again, whether they did or did not, we may never know. But make sure you see that movie because it's a great movie. And don't waste your time with that Nicolas Cage garbage. Go right to the original Christopher Lee Wicker Man movie, and I promise you, you will not be disappointed. Parfait, we did a review. I did a review of that movie on our Beltane Craft episode.
Right.
I will link it at the end of this episode.
I just love Christopher Lee dancing all over town in drag. It just brings such happiness to my life and to my heart.
It's my favorite part too in that movie.
Yeah. And whatever the Druids did or didn't do or believe, they certainly were a very powerful people.
Yeah, nobody dared to ignore the words of the Druids because, really, think about it. They had the power to heal, they understood nature, they could read the stars, and above all, they could divine the future. So that's kind of hard stuff to ignore.
Yeah, and by keeping their secrets closely guarded, they kept their power.
Yes, but by not writing anything down, they also left us completely in the dark and having no real idea about a lot of the truth of who they were.
Yeah, and the only record of my life was actually left by my enemies. I would say I'd be in a lot of trouble. You definitely want to document everything I said.
Bring those receipts, honey. And in the words of Buddha, 1,000 candles can be lit from a single candle.
And the life of that candle cannot be shortened.
Happiness never decreases by being shared.
So thank you for sharing your time and attention with us here at Meg's Magical Mansion.
Till next time.
Toodles!